Charleston celebrates its 350th anniversary this year, and to commemorate that, Charleston Pirate Tours brings you Charleston History Highlights. Hi, Eric with Charleston Pirate Tours. I'm in downtown Charleston in Marion Square, and I'm going to tell you a story that this hotel behind me plays a role in, the Francis Marion. But it begins in Washington, D.C. Up in Washington, D.C., there was a young man named Jack. He was in the Navy, working in naval intelligence. He was an ensign and dating a nice young lady. Now, being from a socialite family, he was always going to the high teas and all the fancy parties. He was dating a young lady who worked with the Washington Times-Herald. Unfortunately, they had a falling out. Now, his sister Kathleen, who also worked at the Washington Times, introduced him to a young lady who was working there with them. Her name was Inga Arvad. Now, Inga had come from Europe. In fact, she had actually come from Denmark. But she didn't begin her career in journalism there in D.C. Actually, she moved to New York and went to Columbia University. And while up there studying English and journalism, all the people that were in classes with her had an odd feeling about her because she kept talking so highly of a young man who was in Europe who she seemed to be quite smitten with, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. And she also had quite a bit of things to say that were not very, shall we say, pleasing about the Jewish community. Well, these people were very concerned about some of the things she talked about at the university, so they wrote a letter to the FBI, so they started a very minimal, cursory investigation into her. Didn't really pick up much steam until she moved down to Washington. And why did that happen? Because Kathleen introduced Inga to her brother Jack, and they became quite an item. Well, when this took place, they began to piece together some things, the FBI, about the lady's background, finding out she not only was acquainted with Adolf, he called her his Nordic blonde, and they had spent quite a bit of time, and even his guest at the 1936 Olympics. Well, J. Edgar Hoover, who quite frankly had no love lost for Jack and Kathleen's family, especially her father, he really ramped up this investigation. Well, at that point, when they found out what was going on, Jack's father sat down with the admiral and they decided they needed to get him out of D.C. So where did they put Jack? Right here in Charleston. He couldn't have been more miserable. He said, I can't believe I have left this high society lifestyle of Washington, D.C., and they've dumped me in this little town called Charleston. Well, he actually rented a room from the Middletons over here off of Murray Boulevard because, frankly, the Navy base was so full of enlisted men, the officers had to find housing off base. But he was so miserable, he started letting Inga know where he was. Well, Inga was apparently as miserable as he was, and she started catching the train and coming down here. And they would originally rent rooms over at the Fort Sumter Hotel, which sits down on the Battery. Well, word got out that she was coming down here. So what did the FBI do? They found out what room they were going to be staying in one weekend in February, and they bugged the room. Well, they apparently found out the room was bugged. So what did they do? They ended up the weekend of the 21st of February of 1942 renting 2 rooms. They rented one at the Fort Sumter Hotel. Their second room, they rented right here at the Francis Marion. That kind of threw the FBI off a little bit, but they finally figured out where they were. So what ended up happening? When they went to lunch, the FBI sneaked into the room and bugged that room and had a few interesting comments in their notes about some of the things that they heard. They even discussed the possibility of getting married. Well, at this point, the FBI was quite interested in Inga, thinking she might have been a full-blown Nazi spy. So once again, stepping into the picture was this man's very influential father. Oh, by the way, just in case you were wondering, he was actually an ambassador to England at one time. So they sat down with this commanding officer and decided, son, we got to get you out of here again and get you away from this woman. So now they send him all the way to the South Pacific. Inga couldn't catch a train to the South Pacific. Well, this young man finally became the captain of a PT boat and became a war hero. Then he was a senator from Massachusetts after the war and eventually became elected the President of the United States of America. You probably know him as John F. Kennedy. Now, as far as the story of Inga, she eventually just sort of faded off. She did marry an actor by the name of Tim McCoy. They had 2 children, and she died in 1993 from cancer. I'm Eric with Charleston Pirate Tours. Happy birthday, Charleston.